Welcome and thank you all for joining today's panel discussion on the current landscape of the criminal justice system and sex trafficking. My name is Michelle Mason, and I am the Policy and Operations Associate at the Institute for Innovation and Prosecution. Today's panel is the first in a series of 4 virtual panels on human trafficking intersectionality in the criminal justice system. I'd like to thank John Jay Student Council for partnering with us on this series, and I'd like to thank John Jay's Pre-Law Institute Office of External Affairs and Psychology Department for co-sponsoring this series. The next panel will take place on November 12th at 5 p.m., and it will discuss intersectionality and trafficking, centering race, gender, and sexuality within the racial justice movement. The following panel will cover the criminalization of survivorship, and it will take place November 30th at 5 p.m. Please follow our socials at IIP_JJAY to register and stay up to date on all upcoming panel events. To send questions throughout today's panel, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If time permits, we hope to respond to some audience questions. I'd like to take this time now to read a land acknowledgement statement, which honors both the land and culture of Indigenous peoples across the country. We want to acknowledge that the Institute for Innovation and Prosecution and John Jay College are based in New York City, which is Lenape-Hoking, the Lenape homeland. We honor all of the Indigenous nations and their land with great gratitude and acknowledge the genocide and continuous displacement of Indigenous peoples. We also acknowledge the enslaved Africans whose labor built Manhattan during the colonial era and beyond. We acknowledge the harm inflicted upon Indigenous communities and people of color across the country, which inspires our ongoing work. And now it's my pleasure to introduce John Jay President Carol Mason, who will share some opening remarks.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this special panel and this special series today. I love it when the work of our Institute for Innovation and Prosecution can work closely with our students and across the college in addressing issues that are important to all of us. And this one is particularly special because you heard that is being co-sponsored by our Student Council with the Institute for Innovation and Prosecution, and also our Pre-Law Institute and our Office of External Affairs, because that shows how important these issues are, and a recognition that across the college, we are using this time to explore issues that may be difficult for some of us to address, but that need our attention, and these voices need to be heard. So I am so proud of our students for raising their hands, and you'll hear more about our student body president shortly. But I want to thank that this is an effort that's not just Institute for Innovation and Prosecution and our students, but it's also our faculty, using the research that happens across this college to look at how we make a difference in our communities in what we do. And it also highlights the wonderful partnership we have across this city, because you'll hear more from the introductions from our student body president. But this is what John Jay is all about. It's bringing all of these communities and stakeholders and voices together to address these important issues that face our communities. So with that, I'm going to turn it to the person you really want to hear from. Our student body president, Amber Rivera, is somebody who is a powerful voice that I am so glad that we get to have at John Jay. I'm so glad that I get to have her challenging me, pushing me to make John Jay a better place. And so you're going to hear her today challenge you all. Those of you who are panelists, be ready, because she's going to challenge you. She's on your side, but she's going to challenge you. And so with that, I turn it over to our wonderful, esteemed president, Amber Rivera. Thank you.
Thank you so much, President Mason. Similar to what Michelle and President Mason said, it's an honor to be here as student government president and co-sponsor this event with the Institute for Innovation for Prosecution and with our Pre-Law Institute and External Affairs. I think John Jay has an extremely unique position within the CUNY system in New York City when it comes to topics like human trafficking, law enforcement, and progressive prosecution. And as a researcher and human trafficking advocate and a survivor of gender-based violence myself, this is an extremely important topic, and I'm just honored to bring this topic to the student government, to the student body, and have everyone here to hear what each of the panelists are doing and all the work they're doing to create change for our society. So without further ado, I'll begin to introduce our panelists. Our first panelist is Tanya Stafford. Tanya Stafford is a native of Dallas, Texas, with over 10 years of experience working with women, young girls, and children. She has a degree in early childhood education and has been trained with the Texas Association Against Sexual Assault program and now sits on the TAASA advisory board. As a survivor of human trafficking who was sold by her mother at a young age, Tanya is focused on eradicating human trafficking one survivor at a time. In the fall of 2014, Tanya founded It's Going to Be Okay, with a mission to seek and create a just world where women, children, and vulnerable adults are safe, respected, and valued. Her ultimate desire is to educate the public about human trafficking and support the victims in rebuilding their lives as she has done. She also serves as a voice for those silenced by death and for the innocent victims who cannot otherwise speak for themselves. Tanya actively participates in rescues and provides victim-centered services alongside her organization, IGTBOK, which serves high-risk youth, women, and their children. Since the fall of 2014, Tanya is a dedicated advocate for women and children, and her testimony at Texas State Senate hearings helped pass House Bill 2290, which recognizes January as Human Trafficking Prevention Month. Tanya has used her story of resilience and knowledge of this underground world in training with FBI, law enforcement, Homeland Security, SVU, SANE nurses, hospitals, airline security and staff, school professionals, and faith-based community leaders, as well as medical professionals, prosecutors, and more. This coming spring, Tanya will be publishing a book on her life. Welcome, Tanya. We're happy to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. I am so pleased to be here and pleased to be a part of this and to share what we're doing here on this side of this state. So thank y'all for having me. Thank you, Amber, for inviting me. And I had time because I'm on a high profile case right now. So I have some downtime today, running in and out hotels all weekend. So it's been an interesting 2-3 weeks. So thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. Our next panelist is Amy Capona, who joined the NYPD in 2008. She was promoted to lieutenant in 2017 and assigned to the Weiss Enforcement Division in 2018. She has served as the commanding officer of the Weiss Human Trafficking Team since January 2020. Prior to her current assignment, she served as a police officer in Housing Police Service Area 2 in Brooklyn, as a sergeant in Brooklyn at the 81st Precinct, and she served 3 years with the Internal Affairs Bureau. In 2017, upon being initially promoted to lieutenant, she was assigned to the 30th Precinct in West Harlem. Thank you, Amy, for being with us.
Thank you for the introduction and thank you for having me.
So on to our next panelist. David Weiss is Deputy Chief of the Human Trafficking Unit at Kings County, so Brooklyn, New York District's Attorney Office, and the Law Enforcement Chair of the ECM Brooklyn Human Trafficking Task Force. After starting his career in 2006, he was previously assigned to the Felony Trial Zone handling cases involving violent assaults, robbery, and murder, and the Healthcare Fraud Unit investigating doctors and pharmacists. David has been in the Human Trafficking Unit since 2014. In 2015, David led an investigation and prosecution which resulted in the takedown of hotel owners permitting prostitution in hotels in Brooklyn and Queens. David was also cross-designated as the Special Assistant United States Attorney for the Eastern District of New York to bring federal sex trafficking charges in a case involving several underage girls. David regularly presents on human trafficking investigations and prosecutions throughout New York State and for international law enforcement officials through the U.S. Department of State International Visitors Program. Thank you, David, for being with us.
Thank you very much, Amber, and also I want to thank John Jay and the Institute for having this panel and inviting me. Thank you all.
We're happy to have you. Our next panelist is Jamila Julie, and Jamila is a court-appointed referee at the New York State Unified Courts. There she handles cases involving custody, visitation, guardianship of children, and order of protection. Prior to her current position, she was a prosecutor at the Brooklyn DA's office for 15 years. She served as counsel in the sex crimes unit and prosecuted major trafficking cases. During her time at the DA, she was the supervisor of 3 anti-prostitution programs, EPIC, STAR, and Project Respect, the assistant supervisor of the Human Trafficking Intervention Court Part, and co-chair of the Brooklyn Sexual Assault Task Force, a multidisciplinary task force used to educate providers and witnesses about sexual assault and victims' rights. Thank you, Jamila, for being with us.
Thank you for having me. Thank you today. It's a pleasure to be here.
And our last panelist, but not least, is Professor Anila Duro, who is also a part of the John Jay community. Anila Duro is currently pursuing her doctorate in social welfare at the CUNY Graduate Center and Silverman School of Social Work. She has a strong interest and background in the eradication and prevention of human trafficking. Her current work addresses law enforcement structural barriers in investigating human trafficking. She plans to focus her dissertation on sex trafficking victims' experiences with law enforcement, and in particular, police education and training. Her recent conference presentations include Understanding the Modus Operandi of Human Trafficking, an International and Domestic Perspective at Columbia University, and Women Trafficking Today, a Framework of Policing Women Trafficking and Providing Effective Immigration Policies at ACS in New York, New York. In addition, her research and teaching experience focuses on intimate partner violence and corrections. Professor Duro has taught courses on institutional treatment of the offender and research methods in criminal justice. She has held various professional positions at John Jay College, where she has worked closely with graduate, undergraduate, and police programs, as well as students. Currently, she is the administrative director for the Department of Psychology, where she provides administrative and academic support to students and faculty. Thank you, Anila, for being here with us.
Oh, thank you, Amber. What a pleasure to work with you. Hi, everyone. I know most of you, but Tanya, it's a pleasure to be with you on this panel. And I just want to say a warm welcome to my students who were supposed to be in class today, but this is our class, CJBS 250, who are studying human trafficking. Thank you so much for having me, Amber.
Thank you all for joining this panel discussion. To begin with, I would like to ask each of the panelists in any order, what compelled each of you to this field of work?
Well, for me, it was my story being sold at the age of 13 by my mom, and coming out of it being saved by my neighbor compelled me to want to give back, to want to go and look for all the Tanyas that didn't have a voice or wasn't seen, because for so many years, I was in that situation for 10 years and nobody looked for me. So one of the things that I always tell my girls and women, they're all my girls, I always tell them that I love them and I look for them. If nobody else loves them or look for them, I do. So that's what really compelled me, was my story. And my neighbor actually told me she didn't save me to sit on it. So it was kind of like divine that I do what I do, and being boots on the ground. So that's what compelled me.
Thank you.
I'll go. I kind of fell into it, not at the time I was transferred into the special victims unit. I came from, like you said, from the healthcare fraud, and prior to that, the trial zone. I never really had experience with special victim type cases, or specifically like human trafficking cases. So it was kind of a move that I wasn't looking for. But once I started seeing the work and doing it, and I recognized how important it is and how difficult it is. And also it's a population, and I think everyone can agree with me, it's a population that no one really understands until they're involved with it, and really what goes through and what it involves with. So my first week in that unit, and I was handed a case that was significant, and there was a mother with her 4-year-old kid who was held for a few weeks, and that opened up my eyes to really what's going on. And that's a big part of it. Like, the awareness, no one really understands unless they're working in it or unfortunately involved with it. And I think once they start doing that, then you see how rewarding working in these type of cases and having just results actually happen.
Thank you, David.
I guess I'll go. I joined the NYPD. It's so cliche, but to make a difference and help people. And I know throughout my career, I definitely made a difference and helped people. But when I began working with trafficking victims, it really fulfilled me. It's been the most rewarding job assignment in my career yet today.
Thank you.
So what propelled me actually was the fact that when I first encountered human trafficking survivors. There was, in fact, no statute in the state of New York. There was no sex trafficking statute and no labor trafficking statute. And we were kind of hamstrung with the charges that we could file because there was no sex trafficking statute. So even though the behavior of, colloquially what we call the pimp was clear sex trafficking, because sex trafficking wasn't a law that was on the books, we had to charge, promoting prostitution, which, not nearly as much teeth when it comes to a prosecution as sex trafficking. And the young woman that I encountered was, in fact, one was 12 and the other one was 13. And the Vice Squad had actually been given a tip. Just an anonymous guy called on the phone and said, he heard about this house. He found the phone number on Craigslist. That's how far back this is. Craigslist, right? He found this number on Craigslist and he, was going to have sex. And when he got there, he realized that the two women, and they were not women, they were girls that were being offered, were clearly not 20 and 21, as he was being told. And he really believed that they were much, much younger. He actually thought they were, 14, 15. But it turns out the Vice Squad he left the phone number of the location. They called, they get an invite, they go in. And I remember prepping the Vice detective for grand jury, and he was like, it was astounding to him, because when he looked at the two young women, he knew that they in fact were not 20 and 21. Like, he just knew. He was like, you could see it all over their faces. And there was just, promoting prostitution didn't really, and endangering the welfare of a child didn't really have teeth, but we did everything we could to ensure that both of the men who were abusing these two girls were prosecuted to the fullest extent. But if there had been a sex trafficking statute, it would have had more teeth. They probably would have gotten more time. It just would have been a stronger prosecution. But that's how I kind of fell into the work. I fell into the work from a sex crimes angle. And so that's what propelled me to go forward, was seeing that, these two young women, so obviously vulnerable and in need of protection, were being exploited by two adults who were making money off of them, and kind of brainwashing these girls to believe that they were, that they were benefiting not just the pimps, but themselves by offering these kinds of services. And so, it was certainly the over-sexualization of two very, very young children who never should have been in the situation that they were in. And yet, without the police, without the prosecutor's office, likely never would have been extracted, and would have fallen deeper and deeper into sex trafficking. They had only been working about a month, but even in speaking to them, their demeanor was so vastly changed from what for what you imagine a 12 and 13-year-old behave like, that you could see that just that brief amount of time was going to impact the rest of their lives, and how they thought about interactions with adults, and the level of trust. And, that's what drove me into this, is just seeing the vast amount of harm that was being done.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Jamila. Anila?
Sure. So it's a little bit combined, my experiences with what you all spoke about. I was born and raised in Albania. And as a young girl, I got to witness young girls and women being trafficked abroad. And this was the perception that we all had, international trafficking, in particular sex trafficking. So when I moved in the States, I was very committed to doing this work for the women. Right, so it started as understanding international sex trafficking, how everything happens, to now my shift has been understanding domestic sex trafficking, working with my students and seeing them as survivors of sex trafficking. I've come to the conclusion that prostitution in America is sex trafficking, and we need to have more conversations around this. So for me, it gets a little bit personal. It's a very, I'm very committed to justice and women empowerment and survivor-led programs. And so through research and through teaching, I do that, and I'm very committed to this work.
Thank you for sharing that, Anila. So the next question is either for Amy or David. So many of our panelists and attendees are based right here in New York City. Could either of you begin by sharing some trends in the current state of trafficking within New York City?
I'll answer that. Right now, we're seeing social media. Social media is huge with both recruiting and exploiting the electronic payments through these like Cash App, Venmo, Apple Pay, these tracking apps, how our victims are being tracked by their traffickers on apps like Find My iPhone and Life 360. Even social media has tracking. Snapchat has tracking. OnlyFans has become increasingly popular during the coronavirus lockdown. What that is an online content sharing platform where you could share any kind of content, but it's very popular with the sex workers. So followers subscribe for a monthly fee for video clips and photos. Trafficking in New York City hotels and motels since the pandemic. New York City's got no tourism. So, the hotels are empty. There's a considerable amount of vacancies. So a lot of trafficking going on in the hotels. Traffickers are targeting the young, vulnerable victims residing in foster homes, group homes, facilities, runaways, homeless. Basically, we're seeing young girls more often recruiting other young girls. And basically victims are being enticed with, expensive clothes, shoes, cell phones, things like that. Dave, you have anything to add?
I think you pretty much covered. I mean, you see it from the citywide perspective. I see just Brooklyn, but it's similar all across the city. It's similar across the country where it's that method. And what I've noticed in the last couple of years is the hotels and the streets are picking up again. For a while, the streets had kind of not gone away, but like the street prostitution, the street tracks were not as active as it has been in the last year or two. So I've seen an uptick in the street prostitution, which also brings with it the street violence and related violence that happens on the tracks.
Thank you for sharing that. Anila, your research primarily focuses on the relationship between law enforcement and trafficking survivors. Would you be able to tell us a bit more about what you found to be the most pressing issues that need to be addressed within the survivor and law enforcement relationship?
Oh, sure. Thank you, Amber. So as we have discussed, we have already touched a little bit on these conflicting societal views we have and the different models on prostitution, sex work, and sex trafficking. And all of these terms have already been mentioned by all of us. And they have always been contradicted policy and law enforcement laws in particular. So policing sex trafficking and sex work or prostitution presents a very complex nexus, which is impacted by morality, personal views we may have, police organizational culture, enforcement of prostitution and sex trafficking laws. And when I look at the relationship between law enforcement and survivors, research shows that this has been negative from the research that we know. Has been negative, has been violent, and challenging for victims and survivors. And we all know that. But we also know that there has been some positive interactions, okay, and case studies. And with all of you, I've seen you do some very positive work around how you deal with survivors and the work that you're doing. But I think it's also very important to acknowledge that some of these interactions are negative and there's a lot of work to be done. And when I address the relationship, I usually raise these two questions. One, that what we have to keep in mind is, what is the law enforcement role? The traditional role of law enforcement has been, right, to enforce the law. And when I conceptualize the relationship that a survivor may have with a law enforcement officer, it's around, David, you and I have been talking about this, it's around the power dynamic, right? So anyone that has arrest power, right, they already have power over you as a law enforcement officer. And so that relationship requires a lot of trust, which happens quite often among the survivors. So the way I conceptualize that relationship is through three elements. And you all know this, but we can go through this briefly together. One is the police behavior and attitudes towards the victims. And for those of you that are very specialized in this area, you already know how to treat a survivor or a victim. But many of our officers who encounter a victim don't know what to do. They cannot even identify it, right? And that the behavior and the attitudes on an officer usually are around the consent to engage in prostitution. And most of the officers go with that idea that this woman in particular, because the majority are women and young girls, engage in prostitution, and that may be an indicator that the victim was not trafficked. The second component is that identifies the relationship is the victim behavior attitudes. And I think it's important to acknowledge that that relationship is kind of threatened by this victim behavior and attitudes towards officers, because sex trafficking victims fear the police, right? And that, I will go a little bit deeper in a few on that, but that sex trafficking victims fear you, right? If you're a police officer, you need to know and acknowledge that there is a fear because of their prior experiences with law enforcement, in particular policing and over criminalization or being over policed. The other one that we have seen in research and in my practical work and in my evaluation work through the task force, we have seen that there is this police structural barriers, that you may have officers and you may have law enforcement agents that want to do the right thing, but they lack the resources, there is their resistance, and this is not a top priority for police departments, right? And I would have to say, including the NYPD right now, not all resources are going towards the sex trafficking and rescuing of survivors and young girls. And then there are two elements that my research looks into it, which I look forward to discussing with you further. When we look at the relationship between law enforcement and survivors, we have two things that we need to really touch upon, and that is the historical context of women and law enforcement, in particular Black girls and women in America, and how that has impacted their criminalization in the context of that frame. And the other one is the historical context of policing, right? That we are policing sex, and we don't know for what reasons or not, but we mainly know that this is a moral threat for most people. And police, in particular police, have been always forced to legislate morality. So the way forward is to understand these relationships for all of us, from policing to academics to advocacy work to survivors-led program, and to come together and say, well, what are we going to do to improve this relationship? Instead of doing the blaming from one another, is to understand that we are all in this together, and how are we going to address it? And the pressing issue right now, Amber and everybody, is that a lot of the law enforcement initiatives and programs lack the engagement of survivors. We need to include survivors. We need to empower and engage survivors, just like what we're doing today. Tanya, I see you nodding. I'm with you. Right, we need to empower so that the survivors can challenge the legal and law enforcement structures that are created to criminalize them. This work is about them, right? And to my opinion, survivor engagement means accountability and change. So I think that's one of the pressing issues that we can focus on right now. Thank you for that question, Amber.
Thank you, Anila. And before I move on to the next question, I would just like to elaborate. I know that we're going to get into the demographics and the concept of race and which which communities are more often targeted by the crime of human trafficking. But I think it's important what you brought up and what we'll get into later to talk about maybe the power structures and the lack of trust when it comes to survivors, but especially with the relationship. If the survivors are often coming from minority communities and there already are stigmas around relationships with law enforcement, that might be another barrier for law enforcement, prosecutors, and survivors to overcome in the work of coming out of this situation and getting the help and the justice that they need. So thank you for bringing that up. Amy, in your experience at NYPD, what are the ways in which law enforcement in New York City are addressing human trafficking?
Well, just to follow up with hers, training, with training all the patrol officers and supervisors, and everyone in the department is now getting more training on identifying trafficking victims, what the indicators are, and what to do, what not to do. So I think the department definitely has improved with that. Also, our technology is advancing, so we're more successful identifying trafficking victims and their traffickers. Our investigations, we're conducting more long-term investigations, resulting in stronger cases, and for those that are convicted, more meaningful sentences. Collaboration with our partners, is paramount. The district attorney's offices, we work very closely with them. ACS is essential to us. New York City Mayor's Office to End Domestic and Gender-Based Violence Anti-Trafficking Unit, the Family Justice Center, Safe Horizons. I mean, dozens of service providers we're working with. We're doing presentations within the department, community outreach with local churches, chapels, community council meetings, PTA meetings, Board of Ed. We are doing rescue operations daily, if very often, going out there and rescuing us, especially juveniles that are missing, runaways. We also have the Target Communication Deterrence Message program, which also known as the TCDM, which is an online software program. It's used as a proactive tool to discourage individuals from going online and patronizing or soliciting commercial sex workers. Essentially, what we have undercovers that post fake ads for prostitution, and then individuals respond to these ads by either phone call or text. And then the program captures the individual's pedigree information, and later on, a deterrence warning is sent via text message to the individual to dissuade them from going online in the future for the purpose of purchasing sex. Also, NYPD has a trafficking hotline, 646-610-7272. So those are just some things that law enforcement is doing.
Thank you so much for your response. And I just want to also thank you again for the work that you're doing and just answering that call. I know that it's probably not easy all the time, but I just appreciate what you're doing for the victims of sex trafficking and the ways that your work is also probably preventing other victims from falling into the trap of sex trafficking. So thank you. for
Thank
what
you.
you and the task force are doing.
Thank you.
Tanya, as someone who works on the ground assisting survivors who have escaped human trafficking, what suggestions or changes in the justice system would you recommend in order to better serve survivors?
Ooh, that's a good one too. What I would suggest is treating them as victims and not as criminals. That's what we see a lot. As Anila said, the interaction with law enforcement, police officers, DAs, they're treated as criminals and not victims. They're seen as, oh, you were just out there prostituting. Or, for example, she's 24 now. She just delivered on 3 days ago. And one of the things that happened with her was she was being forced, and she had been in trafficking for over a year. And the first thing they did was they picked her up and they took her to jail. And then they identified her. There's a district attorney here that I work closely with, and she was the one that went down and identified her. The police officers, and she was fearful of police officers. And one thing that he told her was, you're going to get a ticket for soliciting. You're going to get a ticket for soliciting. There's nothing you can do about it. You was just a prostitute, and that's all you were doing. And so when we got her, it was like that was hanging over her head until we went and identified her and said, no, you have to see her as a victim, see her as a trafficking victim. She was willing to testify against her pimp. And he not only had her, he had a lot of girls. And so this was cracking like a big case as well. So the justice system, but she still had that ticket lingering over her, that solicitation ticket. And it was like, we had to really fight to get that solicitation ticket off from over her head so that she wouldn't have a warrant out for her arrest, because she didn't show up. She didn't show up for court because we had her in protective custody. I had to fly her to another state in order to keep her safe from the pimp that was looking for her. So it needs to change with the identification of trafficking victims. And they're not really survivors until they get the resources that they need to survive. And that's what we put in place, is the resources that they need to be able to survive. But one thing that needs to change with law enforcement, with district attorneys, and anybody that's coming in contact with victims, is you must see them as a victim and not, oh, they wanted to do this. Because we had a 9-year-old that was on Harry Hines here in Dallas, Texas. She was 9 years old. You tell me what 9-year-old says, wake up and say, I just want to be a prostitute today. They did not identify the child. They identify her as a child, but also the stupid officer wrote her a ticket. A 9-year-old. He wrote her a ticket for solicitation, and not just taking her straight to the hospital because she was being forced by her family. They were staying in a motel, they're poverty ridden, and the disparages between the races are, she was a little Black girl. She got a ticket, a 9-year-old got a ticket for solicitation. Not for seeing her as, baby, what are you doing out here? How can we help you? Where's your mom? Where's your dad? Where's your siblings? But no, solicitation. And it's so embarrassing because you go before a judge and it's like a 9-year-old got a ticket for solicitation. It needs to change with how you identify a victim, period, across the board. Nobody wakes up and say, I'm going to be a prostitute today, or I just want to go out here and have sex with 50 men a day to make a quota. And that's what we run into all the time, is that part of the justice system. Can we help them instead of re-victimizing them, because they're already terrified? And when I say terrified, they don't like the police. They're not calling the police. They don't want the police to come because if they're not rescued, guess what? They're left in that situation to where that pimp will beat them or sell them to another pimp. And the gorilla pimps are really the worst ones. So if one of the girls have a gorilla pimp, it's worse for them because it's like, okay, it's your life or mine. I'm not spending life behind bars because of you. So it gets worse and sometimes death. So we have to look at that too. You have to identify them when you first come in contact with them. And a lot of training needs to be had to identify victims and who victims are. A victim looks like me and all her teeth aren't missing. And she can have on Bath and Body Works. She is a human being. But if you don't identify her, you would just think that she was out there selling herself to just make ends meet or fix the next drug habit. And all of our victims aren't on drugs. That's what people fail to realize too. Some of them will catch a drug charge. It's because the pimp will give them the drugs and say, you better say it's yours. So they're re-victimized again. And there's a drug charge hanging over them. And just imagine that door, that revolving door goes on and on and on, because if they get away with just a ticket and they get caught again, they get another ticket. And then if they get caught again, they get another ticket. So it just piles up. We have girls that have about 20, 30, 40, 50 tickets for solicitation and drug paraphernalia. So the system needs to identify them as victims.
Thank you, Tanya, for sharing that. So before I go into the next question, I remember, David, that you spoke about kind of that transition in your career as a prosecutor, from being able to learn and become more aware of human trafficking survivors and being more trauma informed, and how that like shifted your perspective. Would you care to share anything right now around the transition from criminalization into being more trauma informed, and how that helped with the way that you apply your advocacy as a prosecutor in this arena?
Sure. So right now, first and foremost, and I know it's the law in New York State dealing with sexual assault victims, but in practice in our office, we've been doing it for years, even before the law was instituted, was anyone in the special victims unit has trauma-informed training, how to speak with victims, how to recognize the signs, and how to treat victims properly and in a trauma-informed way. And transitioning that to human trafficking cases, everyone, like Tanya was saying, everyone doesn't look the same, or everyone doesn't look like a victim stamped in their forehead. You have to recognize the signs. They're not right away willing to disclose what they're doing. So, I mean, part of it is coming just from being a decent human being, just treating them with respect. I mean, I know I've seen it from law enforcement, I've seen it from other prosecutors, I've seen it from the courts, from the judges, from every part of the system where they don't treat them as equal people. And I think that in general, treating people with respect goes a long way towards building that trust, and also showing that, yes, the cliche about prosecutors is all about the biggest conviction, the biggest jail sentence, or how many people you convict and you prosecute, but it's, especially in the trafficking field, what I've seen and how I conduct my business is, who can I help? How can I help? And the best way to help. And the best way to help is punishing the pimp, helping the girl get safety. And sometimes it means having to say, we're not going to make a case because that's not in the best interest of the girl, and it's not most safe for her. She's not in a safe space where she can get away from this pimp, and just forcing her to testify or forcing the case to go forward can actually put her in more harm. So there we have to evaluate the benefits for society and what we can do. And if you're speaking about being trauma informed and working with victims in a proper way, you putting them first is the number one thing. Always look at what is the best way for the victim. Is it going to hurt her to force her to testify or make a case, or see how we can improve ourselves in our investigations and prosecutions where we don't require her testimony, where we can make a case where we don't have to put her through that. Because even if she's willing, there's still that element of re-traumatizing, and just getting on the stand in front of everyone is tough. And even if she's the most willing person to testify, if we can avoid it, we want to, because if we recognize that it's in her best interest not to have to get on the stand and testify in front of strangers of the horrific things that happened to her, we'll try to do that if we're able to do it in a legal way. So I think putting the victim first in any sense always will go a long way to building that trust, keeping them aware of the cases at every stage of the investigation. Keep them aware, let them know what's going on, let them know that they're a part of it and they're not just being another agency or person or unit that's using them for whatever we want from them and then discarding them, where it's, no, you're part of the case. We're gonna let you know, we want you to testify in the grand jury. He's being arrested. This is the plea offer that we're thinking of negotiating. This is the issues with the case. Let them know that they're an integral part of the case from the beginning and that they have a voice in how it will proceed as well. I think will go a long way to showing them that we're actually about the victim, trying to help them in the right way. And it helps the case, but more importantly, it builds that trust. And that's one person that, hey, this prosecutor or this detective is actually doing well, is actually doing good. And not all people are bad in that world. And slowly by slowly, like building that trust where we are showing that we're doing the right thing because we want to.
Thank you so much for sharing your perspective on that. So our next question is for Jamila, Amy, or David, whoever would like to answer or answer first. Brooklyn uses a collaborative model between survivors, law enforcement, and service providers to address the issue of human trafficking. All of you have been part of the creation of this model in your office. Could you tell us a bit more about what this model is?
So just to clarify also with the bio, when you said the ECM, that stands for Enhanced Collaborative Model. That's we're a federally funded task force where the federal government years ago recognized the need to have service providers and law enforcement work together, because without working together, you're not going to either make a dent or do anything. So the point of this model is to put law enforcement, service providers, and survivors together, where we regularly meet, we regularly discuss the best practices, and also to know who we are and know who the local players are in each jurisdiction, where we have regular meetings so we know the right organization to call if we need. So if we have a particular victim, instead of opening the phone book and going through what number to call or who should I call, what 800 numbers, like we know the person in charge. We meet with them regularly. Hey, Lieutenant, this is a case I have, this is an issue I have, where it kind of cuts through all that red tape, where we're able to provide those services in a quicker way, where we all work together. And I know in Brooklyn, we have all the prosecutor's office from around the city. We all regularly meet as part of the task force. We meet separately. We have dozens of service provider organizations that all come together. We're meeting to discuss the latest trends and best practices and the best way to help victims in this case and pair them up to get the appropriate resources as quick as possible and in the best way. And I know that's really what it's about, making sure that the victims are treated and given the appropriate resources in the best way possible. So this is the model across the country, and also in terms of working for the victim in a victim-centered way and coming up with creative ways to do victim-centered investigations. And part of that is every interview we do, or at least we try to do if we're able to, is have the law enforcement, the detective with the prosecutor and a service provider, a social worker present all together for the interview. So the victim is comfortable, can speak to someone, an advocate for themselves if they need to, that's not law enforcement, just so they're aware and they're comfortable as they're going through the process. And everyone being together instead of there's a call out and the detective goes first and does an interview with the victim, and as necessary, the victim has to recount what happened to them. Okay, well now we have to go to the DA's office and meet the prosecutor and then have to recount the story again. And then we have to move forward. Like you're just repeating the story over and over again. Part of this model is put people together, be on the same team and do it collaboratively where it's all about the victim.
Thank you. Amy or Jamila, would you like to share?
Sure. I think the goal of ECM is to provide a safe and collaborative environment for the survivor so that she knows that she's supported, right? So you have a social worker there who can provide emotional and social support, connect your survivor with additional services outside of the district attorney's office, help your survivor navigate other aspects of her life beyond the prosecution, because the DA's office is focused on prosecution. That's what we do. But oftentimes your survivor needs additional services. So she may need a way to apply for HRA benefits, but she can't do that because she doesn't have a birth certificate or she doesn't have her social security card. So connecting her with services to provide the stepping stones and the building blocks to permit the survivor to reestablish her life in a way that is separate and apart from the trafficking and separate and apart from the trafficker. Oftentimes you find that the trafficker will confiscate their personal documents. Well, that inhibits you if you're going to try to look for a job, right? Because you need your social security number, you need your photo ID. There are so many services that you cannot access unless you can prove who you are. And so part of that is providing services outside of prosecution, because when I was a prosecutor, that's what I did, right? I knew very much about the penal law. I could cite the CPLR backwards and forwards, but I couldn't necessarily navigate how to help someone get a social security card or replace their social security number, right? I couldn't necessarily navigate how to get a copy of their birth certificate, how to get an address or at least a mailing address or a PO box so that when you apply for benefits, there's an address, right? When you apply for a job, there's an address, because if you want to move out of trafficking, there are things that you need to be able to do that. And having an address and having all your documents enables you to do that. That's why having a social worker is so critical to connecting your survivor with services, because it allows, it ensures that she knows that you see her as a whole person who is not just a survivor of trafficking, who's not just a prostitute, right? And it provides her agency in the sense of what, you know, you can say, this is what we do in this office and this is what we're going to do. But outside of the prosecution, what do you need? You need stable housing. Let's figure out what that looks like, right? Maybe it's trying to get you on the list to get into public housing. Maybe that's helping you enter the shelter system so that you can get another stable housing. Maybe it's connecting you with an agency that provides housing specifically for survivors to help you become stable, because once you have a place to live, then it's so much easier to get in contact with you, right? But it's also so much easier for you to reestablish your life and to put this incident of trafficking behind you. And so that's what we try to do. It's police officers, prosecutors, social workers, victim advocates coming together to help rebuild a life. And part of what we do in the DA's office is prosecution. And I view that in some ways as helping to rebuild a life, right? Helping to hold someone accountable who did something to you that was criminal, but not forgetting that you are more than a victim, right? So also providing you with the ability to move forward from victimhood to survivorship by providing other resources. And so I have always believed that once a survivor knows that you see them as a whole person and not just the means to a conviction or a stat, you have built a level of trust that can flow both ways, right? I trust you, you trust me, we work together. I have found that when I was a prosecutor and I established that level of trust, my witnesses would call me and say, hey, I heard about this guy who I think is pimping young girls, and his name is XYZ and his street name is this, and he drives this car, and I think you should really look into him. And I know that you might not want to talk to me because, yeah, I'm back in the life and I don't really want to be back in the life, but like, I'm giving you this information. I would say, okay, yeah, I get it. You're back in the life, but let's come into my office, right? Let's come into my office and let's talk about, I understand that there's a case. Yes, I'm going to have to disclose that you went back to working, but that's not the end of it, right? So yes, I have to disclose that you're working, but I also have a social worker that I can connect you with again. And maybe we can start talking about what that transition looks like. And thank you for this information on additional prosecution. You come in, you talk to me, you give me the information that you have, but I still want to deal with your underlying issues, because I appreciate that you've given me another case and maybe I can get another trafficker off the streets. But I also appreciate that there are drivers in your life that are pushing you back into to trafficking or prostitution work or sex work, whatever you want to call it. And I want to help address those with you. And I want you to know that I'm here regardless of whether or not you choose to continue with this prosecution, because sometimes, witnesses are fearful and they back out, and you say, okay, then I will try to structure a plea deal that doesn't require you to testify. But just because I'm taking this plea or I'm offering this plea, that does not mean that I can't still support you and I can't still help you get the services you need. So there were times when I had witnesses come for years, right? They would just call me out of the blue to say, hey, I need some help. I really don't want to go back to the life, but there are pressures here. What do I do? Come into the office. Let's talk about that. Because I know you don't have an active case, but you don't have to have an active case. You're a person. I'll try to hook you up with the services. I'm always, available to you. And so that's what I think is important, is trying to see the whole person and letting them know that you're more than just a prosecutor. You're a person too. You see them as a person, and the detectives and the sergeants and the lieutenants and the social workers you work with also see them as a person. And the prosecution is not the be all and end all of the relationship that you have with them.
Thank you. The next question is for Anila. Throughout your work, you have tried to be explicit in highlighting the intersectionality that happens between race and human trafficking. Could you speak to the importance of focusing on race, and how can other researchers or people within the justice system work to center some more of the marginalized experiences?
Okay, well, thank you, Amber, for that. Before I move to the question, I just want to make a comment. When I worked with the Brooklyn DA's office, the word around was that Jamila prosecuted like a beast. Right? But I think we also have to add a second sentence to that, and she cared for the survivors. And one of the good things about the collaborative model that I learned in my findings when I did your evaluation, in particular for the NYPD, this was one of their major feedback, was that this collaborative model has been so helpful for law enforcement, in particular policing, because you have access to the social workers, to social service providers. So when they encounter a victim on the streets, they will know not to make an immediate arrest, but they would call Safe Horizon, they would call all of the task force members and find out who can provide services for that night, for that day. So congratulations to you all for doing this work. And Tanya, you can join the task force. David, I'm taking the liberty and inviting Tanya, but they would love to have you as well. Let's shift our conversation around race. And I just want to acknowledge that I am a white immigrant woman, and I have this privilege to talk about race and not get retaliated and also be taken seriously. But I also want to acknowledge that I do this work around race because I care for the bodies and the lives of the young Black girls that I've worked with, that I educate, and the young Black women who are now survivors. So this work is to improve their lives and not add into my academic capitalism or research or teaching. I think this work for me personally is to improve your lives, ladies. And I'm happy that I heard the word Black twice or three times in this conversation, but I'm very explicit in highlighting the victim's survivor's race. Because we are not talking about racism, we are not talking about racial injustice and racial trauma, right? The trauma that you're talking about is different for Black girls and Black women, as we should in the context of sex trafficking. And thanks to Michelle Mason, who published that article that validated my thinking, that validated the narratives of my students and survivors around Black Lives Matter movement and how that now looks in the context of sex trafficking. So it is very important, and this is why, to talk about race, right? Because we all know that their social construction of race is deeply rooted in law law enforcement practices, right? I don't think we can doubt that anymore. And policing sex trafficking in the US has a racialized component where women of color, and I'm going to say Black girls and women, are inappropriately criminalized or over-policed, right? And so here are some questions. Why are 80% of survivors Black at the federal level? When Polaris Project released their national data of their hotlines, 80% of them were Black. We could say victims, survivors, they were Black, 80%. And that should be an alarming statistic. And this was 2 years ago, right? But personally, I've seen who the victims and survivors are. I'm questioning myself as an academic, as a human being, right? Like I'm just questioning myself and saying, oh, they're Black, and we're not saying why they're Black. Why 80% of survivors in Brooklyn needed criminal justice advocacy when I looked at the data, right? Because they, as you all said, and as have you given case examples, they have been criminalized. They have some type of criminal record, and now the social worker is going to help them, and legal aid is going to help them through advocacy to remove these charges, right? Why are so many missing young Black girls? Every day, many and many, right? I'm afraid to count. Why prostitution rates are the highest in Black communities? When I originally started doing the work with the Bronx and Brooklyn, I wanted to see the prostitution rate data. I wanted to see how many prostitution arrests are we making, and the numbers are alarming. We are arresting women, young women, on prostitution charges. And again, I go back to my general comment, how I conceptualize sex trafficking in America, and it is prostitution if we look deeper and deeper and deeper. So, right, so this question lead me to talk a little bit about racism, right? And racism oppresses people of color, and we all know this, and forces them to engage in prostitution and obscures their consent, right? So when you see a Black girl that perhaps you're thinking she's willingly engaging in it, there are different layers, and we haven't explored how racism impacts their vulnerability as much as we should, and how racism impacts their criminalization in the criminal justice system. Without understanding racism, we cannot fully understand the usual stereotype belief that women of color engage in prostitution on their free will because they enjoy it. And that's probably because of this belief that Texas officer gave a 9-year-old Black girl, and I'm glad that you identified her, that she was a Black girl, because I already knew as soon as you started the story, right? 9-year-old, right? Well, it could be that the Black girls don't look for their age, but that's just a belief that they have. Right, and then we look at this, we look at racism and how race impacts the victim survivors, and we need to situate coercive and forceful elements of prostitution into a broader perspective that includes the role of race and systemic oppression, such as income inequality could be one of the forceful elements that allowed you to engage even freely or without you knowing into the sex industry, right? So it all depends how we also define and how we translate or how we apply the TVPA terms, the Trafficking Victim Protection Act, right? Those elements. And Dave, you and I had this conversation around force. Like, how are you able to conclude that the person was, forced or coerced, right? So I challenge you, you may not agree with me right now, but I challenge you to think about these elements. And then prostitution laws in this country harm the poorest by criminalizing prostitution by choice, right? And that's deeply rooted in the income inequality. And when I compare street and brothel prostitutes, I refuse to use that word, but I'm going to use it, versus escort services, we know who is being criminalized the most, right? And we know that survivors have served prison time. Survivors have criminal records against them, and we need to do a lot of work. And when we look at the data, and when we look at the narratives, and when we look at organizations like Tanya's, It's Going to Be Okay. And we know that our young Black girls and women are experiencing this. I challenge you all to think about what are we going to do? And in research, what I do, because that's something that I can control, or through my advocacy and mentoring work, I engage in critical methodologies, right? So if you're doing a study and you're not thinking about how to measure for race, or how to identify that the women that you are surveying, that you're talking to, and what race and ethnicity they are, I think you really need to look at that. And I think we also have to do something that you all have been talking about, engaging with the community and embodying critical methodologies such as participatory action research, where you engage the survivors to be part of the finding. And I'll give you one example with a very non-well detective that I worked for years. He had a case of a very young Black girl who by that time she was over 18. And he was really forcing that she would trust her, right? But I'm the good cop, right? How many times we hear this? I'm the good cop. I want you to work with me. I'm the good district attorney. I'm the good detective. I'm the good prosecutor, right? Trust me. And he says, Anila, but she's not trusting me. I don't know what to do. I cannot help. And I said, don't take it personal. This has nothing to do with you, and you're a white male. I hope you recognize that. And she's a Black woman. And he wasn't even identifying the race or ethnicity. And I said, it's not about you. It's about the trust issue between her and law enforcement, and about the systemic oppression that young girls are facing in this country. So this is work that will take a lot of time to build, and it has already started with you, and I look forward to helping you further into this. But again, I think we have to question why aren't we doing more that we are now recognizing? Or sometimes, Amy, I would push Lieutenant Sharp to think about it and to give me data. Well, can you describe who the girls are to me? Because he would talk about them. He would talk about the many childhood adverse effect that they had before, right? Like why they're vulnerable. Well, this girl did this, she was sexually abused by her family, right? But then he would miss the component of race. And I said, well, you're a Black man. I need you to tell me that these are Black women and girls. And this is an issue, right? And this is not just a social issue. This is a law enforcement issue, and we have to work together. But like, why are we having such a high number of young Black girls, right, vulnerable to this, number one, and two, why are we arresting and criminalizing them more than any other? Okay, I leave you with those questions.
Thank you, Anila. And just in the interest of time, thank you for all of the attendees that have stayed throughout the duration of the event tonight. We appreciate you coming. I just want to ask one last question before we open up the Q&A. What is something that each of you are hopeful for in the future of anti-trafficking movement?
I hope that people recognizes victims as victims and give them hope. That's really, really my hope. And as Anila said, there was something, just to go back for 1 second and then we'll move on. I know. I was told we interviewed a pimp, and he said something that was so profound. I don't like to talk to them. I despise them. But he said, I can get less time for a Black girl than I can a white girl. And that stuck out to me. Like I was furious. But then I realized that he was right. He received less time for the Black victim than a white victim. A white victim, he said, I can do whatever, I can take I can take her wherever. I can take her across country. I can do whatever I need to do. And I'll get a lot of time for her. But I can do the same thing with a Black victim and I can get less time. And that's how that's how the girls get lost in the system, is because they're not seen as human. The Black girls are not seen as human. And I do apply my own life story to that too. Even though I was reported sold and I was reported missing, nobody looked for me. Like law, and I was afraid of law enforcement too. I was really fearful of law, and law had been to that house that I was kept in for so many years. They had been there. They did nothing to help me until the day I was almost killed in front of my 3 children. And that's when I received the help that I got when I got out, was go to a home that serviced women and children and got counseling. That's what I do for them, is the victim-centered care, is because they don't get that when they get out. And Jamila said something that was profound, was, okay, you got to offer them these services. You can get them out all day long, but if they don't have any resources where they stay, so we provide housing, we pay for legal services, we get them counseling. That's something that's not expensive. But when you look at the Black girl and another, in Hispanics, they go missing at a high rate. Nobody's saying anything. And in the Hispanic community, they don't say anything because they fear being deported. So those girls are missing. And then you have to go to the Indian culture, the indigenous people. Their girls are missing, and they are violated, and then they're thrown on the side of the road. We had this going up and down throughout Texas, Oklahoma, all the borders. And we were wondering why this was happening, but nobody was talking about it because they were considered people of color. That particular race, those particular people are considered people of color. And so you have to go back to the drawing board. When he said that, it's like, wow, he really said their life is not valuable. Their life is not valuable. And that's what I heard. And then to treat them like that, and then they get more jail time for prostitution. They get more time for the solicitation. They get more probation, all the above. And it's like, wow, can we treat them as victims and not subhuman? So my hope is that they get hope. I was given hope. And that's why I hope in everything, is because I was given that hope. It only takes one. It only takes one. You save one, you save a generation. You save her generation, you save her generation, because she's going to teach that generation, her generation, not to do the same thing. And then we also are dealing with people that have past trauma. Most of the Black girls that are trafficked or in trafficking or solicitation or prostitution or anything like that, they have past trauma. They have been abused. 90% of them have been sexually abused, molested, raped at an early age, starting from 6 years old. It starts really, really young. I have a victim right now. She was being trafficked from the time that she was adopted up until now. And she was pretty much a baby meal. And she was in the foster care system. She was in the foster care system. And because she was Black, she did not receive the same help that the other ones received. And that is really sad and shameful. It's because when I go digging into their past, they have a past. And we have to look at the past in order to help them for the future. We have to address the past trauma. And a lot of them are scared and fearful of addressing the past trauma. And my favorite saying to them is, it hurts to heal, and healing hurts. It hurts like hell to heal. And that's just being real with you. You got to hurt in order to heal. And that's a long road for them. And especially Black girls, because we're told to be quiet. You can take the pain. You're superwoman. I told somebody yesterday, I'm not superwoman. I'm human. I hurt. I have to deal with their mental issues. And when I say some mental issues, I mean mental issues. I have a 32-year-old sucking a pacifier right now. It's because she has kind of branched off. She go back to what's comfortable for her. And it goes back to that childhood state. But you look at her past, she was abused. 90% of them are abused before they even are trafficked. And we have to address that as well. We have to get mental help and mental resources into our communities to address all of that. And some of this will stop is if we get them the help that they need. But in the Black community, what is said is what goes on in here stays in here. That's what we're told. You don't tell the family secrets. Be quiet. So my hope is for them to hope. And we can all do something. We're all fighting this fight. We just got to make it bigger.
Thank you, Tanya. Would any of the other panelists like to close and what they would like to see happen in the anti-trafficking movement before we close out?
I don't know how you can top what Tanya said, so everything she said.
I third that, I guess, since David seconded it. I would like to see certainly more resources to go towards the root drivers of trafficking. And they are oftentimes sexism, racism, and poverty, right? I have yet to meet a trafficking survivor who remained in trafficking because she was wealthy and enjoyed it, right? So most of the survivors that I dealt with were dealing with issues of intense poverty, such as, not being domiciled, so homelessness, right? Abuse within their home if they, if they were living with family members or close relatives, there was, oftentimes a history of abuse there. So either physical abuse or sexual abuse, or emotional abuse, sometimes even financial abuse, right? Like whatever job that they were working, all of their money would be taken from them. And so, I think that we can lessen the entrance into trafficking if we can address the root drivers of trafficking. And I think that's essentially what we're all saying, is that we would all like to see less trafficking. And in order to do that, we have to address the root causes, because as a former prosecutor, I was getting to the leaves, but I wasn't dealing with the root. We weren't cutting down the tree. And that's what we'd like to see. As a prosecutor, I would like to see no one trafficked.
Thank you so much. So with that, I guess I'm just the moderator, but I'd like to just also comment on the last question. As a researcher and survivor and human trafficking eradication advocate, and I think I also agree with including more survivors in the conversation. I also just want to say empowering survivors through higher education, and not assuming there's so many stigmas around survivors of gender-based violence, human trafficking, domestic violence, every form of assault, right, or violence that we experience, but just not assuming that we're not capable of healing and becoming, beyond just the trauma that we've experienced, right? And that it doesn't only define us and it's not just a part of our lives, but we also can become prosecutors, police officers, researchers, professors, organization CEOs, much like Tanya. And the sky is the limit, right? Just because we've been targeted by something or we've gone through something doesn't make us any less of an expert or any less capable. And models like the Human Trafficking Task Force that include survivors' voices and give survivors the opportunity to give their feedback on what the best practices and services and experience would be for survivors are extremely empowering to survivors, right? And not just using us, you know, as some organizations and agencies do as spokespersons or tokenizing us. And I just appreciate, again, all of you being here tonight. I appreciate all of the work that you do and all of the people in my life personally and all the other survivors that I don't know or can't name today at John Jay that have been empowered through higher education, through research, through advocacy, and through the work with prosecution that's progressive and with the NYPD working in this collaborative model at the Brooklyn Human Trafficking Task Force. And you know, I admonish all law enforcement and prosecutors across the country to look at that model and try to, you know, emulate the same exact approach in their cities. And I'm just extremely grateful to the work that you all have done. Extremely grateful to the sacrifice that you've made in doing this work, and just appreciative that you were all here today to speak at John Jay and introduce this topic to the community. And be on the lookout for the other 2 panels that we have in the series. And please feel free to reach out to Michelle or myself if you have any more questions or want to get in contact with anyone who is here tonight. Thank you all.